smooth all the way. And Newport's fresh menthol keeps it that way. Smoother and fresher, day after day. The smoothest tasting menthol cigarette.
The US has continued to send Afghan detainees to facilities where prisoners had previously been tortured.
Now that you've seen the new Chevrolet.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA?
We do have people who submit pieces to two American journals.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
It was this testimony from 15-year-old Naira before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, aired inexorably by the media, that helped fuel American indignation to the point of supporting US military intervention in the Persian Gulf in 1991. It was only discovered years later that Naira's testimony was in fact a complete fabrication, as was the entire hearing, which had been organized by Hill & Knowlton, one of America's largest PR firms. However, this is not a recent phenomenon. The use of mass media to manipulate public opinion into supporting a war, electing a leader, or buying one brand over another can be traced back to its infancy in the last decade of the 19th century, during which time Gustave Le Bon published his book The Crowd, Study of the Popular Mind, that went on to influence the field of propaganda and public relations, and key thinkers such as Gabriel Tarde, Walter Lippmann, and Edward Bernays. Since then, an increasing number of individuals have started to ask, what can we do to free ourselves from the will of a hidden few, and how can we learn to identify truth, half-truths, and lies in modern mass media? To answer this in a way not normally done, we need to go back to neutral Switzerland during the First World War, where Rudolf Steiner, an Austrian spiritual scientist, gave a series of 25 lectures on the causes of the war to the workers of the First Goetheanum, published some 72 years later in English as the Karma of Untruthfulness. The fact that many still consider these lectures to constitute an applied media studies course today is testament to the far-sightedness and depth of the methodology that Steiner shared with his audience.
Well, of course, in those days, the mass media was mainly newspapers and magazines. And he encouraged them to look at these in many different ways. So, for example, he himself always sought to look at an issue from different angles. Even today, you'll get people who will only read one newspaper. And so, obviously, if you read a number of newspapers and get a different take on a story, look at it from different angles, from different points of view, your impression and your the basis for any kind of judgment which you're making on that story will be richer and more broad-based. So that was one thing he certainly encouraged them to do, to look at things from different points of view. He encouraged them to look carefully at people who were in the public eye, who were expressing, putting forward points or ideas, particularly what one might call seed ideas, new ideas, to ask themselves, where did this person come from? What sort of stream were they standing in? What was their background? And not simply accept something on face value, so to speak. And similarly, he encouraged them to look at how a certain thing was said, in what sort of place, in what sort of time, even in what sort of astronomical or astrological configuration. So as to really get a picture of current events, which was as wide-ranging as possible.
Early on in these lectures, Steiner drew his audience's attention towards what he referred to as lies that float in public, and asked his listeners not to take anything at face value. He used the example of the Slav Welfare Committee and asked his listeners, what could be nicer than a Slav Welfare Committee under the protection of the government? I will now read you a short letter that has to do with this committee. The president of the Petersburg Committee of the Slav Welfare Society has approached the foreign minister with a request for weapons and ammunition for the Nabokov expedition.
Well, yes, the Slav Welfare Committee, which was run out of St. Petersburg, he referred to, was actually a gun-running operation to put guns into the Balkans in order to stimulate political unrest in the Balkans. And, well, one can think, for example, of the nicely named National Endowment for Democracy in the United States. Yeah? And one can see how, over decades, this National Endowment for Democracy has been associated with, again, providing assistance of one kind or another to groups which seek to overthrow regimes in certain countries so that regimes can then be installed which will be friendly to the United States.
Next, Steiner warned his listeners of certain Western brotherhoods' direct or indirect control of the media to create thought environments in which seed ideas can be planted in the public's subconscious. An example of this was given 11 years later by Edward Bernays in his book Propaganda, where he outlined how a good PR man would sell a Mozart piano. Bernays insisted that it is not sufficient to blanket the country with a direct appeal, such as, "You want to buy a Mozart piano now." Instead, it was the modern propagandist's job to create an environment in which the idea would come naturally to the consumer as if it were their own. To do this, one would stage an exhibition of period music rooms designed by well-known decorators who exerted an influence on buying groups. To make this a newsworthy event, sure of receiving wide media coverage, celebrities and influential politicians would be invited to attend. Finally, influential architects would have been persuaded to make the music room an integral part of their designs. And once a person had a music room, they would naturally think about buying a piano.
Well, it's a surprise.
For me?
For me? For me? Yes, sir. It's for you, and you, and you.
Well, what they gain through doing it is that it is basically a subtle form, or sometimes not so subtle, form of mind control. So that if, for example, you have a problem and you encourage people to think about this problem in society in such a way that you get them to think that there are only two possibilities to think about this problem, so that one is always, the public are always constrained, unbeknownst to themselves almost, because these are the only two views that are ever presented in thinking about this problem, then the public can be guided along these rather narrow channels in the way they think about this problem, so that then it'll become easier for these elite groups to produce the kind of solution to this problem that they actually desire. Yes, if one thinks of a particular example, one could think of how President Ronald Reagan seeded the idea in the early 80s of how good it would be if mankind would collaborate in dealing with an alien invasion.
Just think how easy his task and mine might be in these meetings that we held if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species from another planet.
So he was speaking basically within the context of the Cold War, with the tensions between Russia and America, and saying, well, if there was an alien invasion, I'm sure humanity would get together and unite and turn against the common enemy, you see. And then you can see, for example, how before him there had been a number of films which had been made in America predominantly, which focused on this question of alien encounters. And then as we go on through the following decades, we see that this idea is continually put forward to the point where one can think, for example, of the X-Files in the 1990s. And then in 2001, I think it was, you had a very major public statement by something called the Disclosure Project.
Are you ready for the truth?
I have over 3,000 cases now.
They estimated 100 yards from the left wing was this 100-foot disc.
and the strength of the signal was as strong as the surface contact on the water of an aircraft carrier.
And there you had quite a high-powered presentation by this group of individuals who were really saying, well, the aliens are here and the government is covering it up, and we need to accept that they are here and find ways to work with the aliens. And so this idea has been, of course, continued through the last 10 years or so. And it seems to be now focusing increasingly in the last few years on what's supposed to be happening at the end of 2012.
Where in a new book out later this week, government officials, pilots, and scientists going on the record about their own close encounters.
55% of the American public believes the government is likely withholding information about UFO.
I mean, if we discovered that space aliens were planning to attack, and we needed a massive buildup to counter the space alien threat, this slump would be over in 18 months.
So it builds up a certain expectation as to what could happen at the end of 2012 in relation to alien invasions. So that humanity comes together, humanity becomes one. Well, then who is to be the representative of this humanity? You know, who is to be the governmental leader, for example? Yes. So since the 70s and 80s and Reagan statements, we have been acclimatized through this idea to think of humanity being all together in one form, and then presumably we would have one person or one group or one government who would represent us either to the aliens, in collaborating with the aliens, or in fighting against the aliens.
Steiner never tired of reminding his listeners that it is through the media that we form our thoughts and ideas about the world, and these thoughts determine human action. If our thoughts are full of untruthfulness, then the outcome would be a deeply sick society in which events like the First World War could occur. To counter these destructive forces spread by the media, we must try to find the concept that truly corresponds to the percept if we are to form judgments that deal with realities instead of distortions, an idea that went back to the beginning of his public career with his book The Philosophy of Freedom.
For me, Steiner's philosophy of freedom is the first real resolution of the problem that Kant proposed, that we can't really know anything in itself, that we can really only know its appearances, which leaves us all with a relative picture of the world. Steiner's view counters that very strongly, that we actually derive our knowledge from two directions and two sources. And the first being the way the world appears to us through our sense observations. And to complement that, we need to arrive at the concept most appropriate to that appearance that we arrive at through our thinking. And this is where Steiner resolves what Kant presented as a problem. And that is that through our thinking, we can actually arrive at knowledge of anything that exists. There is no limit or boundary to knowledge other than our own conditioning or our own inner lethargy. So in this regard, what Steiner's ideas present in relation to media studies, of course, is that the media is intent on presenting us with a picture of events to anybody who wasn't present at the events themselves. And we can't really understand the reality of that in Steiner's epistemological ideas by any other means than to thinkingly approach those pictures and arrive at a concept which adequately complements them. So anything we're presented with really requires that inner activity of thinking by the individual to arrive at the reality. The pictures themselves are not real. And this is something that everybody intellectually understands about the media, but rarely do you see people actively countering that with this inner activity to arrive at reality themselves. It's the view of most of the architects of modern spin, doctoring and propaganda that an individual can't arrive at the reality through thinking. So if they can control the mental pictures and provide those pictures to the masses, and by this means they will then put their stamp on the way the masses will perceive this event and accept this version as real. Steiner provides this very remarkable path and approach which really takes the individual out of the chains and the bondage that sort of view places us in.
Steiner stressed again and again the importance of finding out which stream an influential person was standing in, and to ask not what is this person saying, but for whom is he saying it? Whose interests do they represent? This is a task which we are able to perform much more easily now due to the internet than was the case when Steiner gave these lectures.
So you have to be open on the one hand and not rush to judgment, but on the other hand use all the tools that the technology itself provides you to check out and question everything in the ideas which you do get. Yeah? And I think that this is particularly important when we look at certain ideas which come to us from sources which claim to be of a liberal or progressive type. Yeah? Because it is one of the techniques, very subtle techniques of the forces of manipulation, that they try to gain entry into people's souls, really, by using those things which they know already people are inclined towards. Yeah? I'm thinking of various lobby groups, online petition campaigns and the like, which flag up campaigns for young people to support by a click here, a click there. But again, one needs really to look into that and see who is standing behind that, yeah, and follow that trail as far as you possibly can to see what is actually behind it. And if you do that, then I think gradually one comes to have more confidence in one's ability to find these things out, and that confidence actually is much more self-enhancing. You feel more confident, and it's not the case that you feel more fearful. Many people feel fearful in the face of all of this overwhelming amount of information and so on. Yes, but actually, the more you actually get to know in this way, the more confidence that actually gives you, that you understand what's going on. And human beings tend to appreciate knowing. It's when we don't know things that the opportunities for fearful forces and fear-making forces gain entry into our souls.
These have been just a few of the many practical indications given by Rudolf Steiner in the Karma of Untruthfulness, and it is beyond the scope of this film to look at who these hidden manipulators are and what their aims might be. These questions are best answered by reading the books themselves and undertaking your own research, all the while testing the methodology presented here as to whether it is still relevant today.